Ireland's presidential election is swiftly approaching next Friday. Some followers, listeners, might be interested in hearing the following, because it's quite likely, after what has happened approaching this presidential election, that the selection of future presidential candidate is going to have to be overhauled. For the average Irish citizen, taking in their politics via the occasional glance, the would-be presidential pair have been going around the nation stirring up apathy for weeks now. That means there are real fears that turnout in the presidential election, now just 6 days away, could dip to an all-time low. Pollsters say leftist independent Catherine Connolly will be hard to overtake. And the Fine Gael hopeful Heather Humphreys is suffering as a result of voters' anti-government sentiment and housing, health and other bugbears. But folks, voting for either candidate is supporting what has been happening in Ireland since 2020. The loose horse in this sluggish race, Fianna Fáil's Jim Gavin, whose most distinguished campaign move was his decision to quit, crazily still appears to be attracting some smidgen of support. This would be Gavin vote, maybe from the nihilist spoiler vote end of things, or it could be just old-fashioned cussedness. Though you cannot rule out survey responders who are so indifferent that they have not noticed Gavin's limp campaign departure 13 days ago. But let's be honest. These presidential elections have left Irish citizens puzzled in the past, before, during and after often strange campaigns. And this is far from the first time voters have had very limited choices. Folks, expect the presidential selection after this one to be upgraded, because something has to happen with the way they're selected. Almost 90 years after the largely ceremonial office was created by Fianna Fáil's leader, Eamon de Valera, we're still baffled by what, if anything, we expect from our head of state and commander of the defence forces. Our bafflement is compounded by the 7-year presidential term, a legacy, according to some experts, left over from France's Third Republic in the 1870s, when 7 years was deemed the average reign of a monarch. So at least now he is nowhere the 7 years appeared out of, which is their term. It's far too long for some of them. And you can take that bafflement further when considering the main party's recurring decisions not to bother with a presidential election at all, but to instead pitchfork in an agreed candidate. That's correct, because Micheál Martin bull-rode his way through with his selection of a candidate. So after this presidential election in Ireland, expect the selection of future candidates for Ireland's presidency to be upgraded, or overhauled. Something has to be done. What happened back in 1952 when Fianna Fáil's Sean T. Kelly got a second spin by grace of Fine Gael In 1974, when eminent Judge Carville O'Donnell got the nod from all parties after the tragic death of Fianna Fáil's president Erskine Childers in 1976 and 1983, when Patrick Hillary got two full terms without an election for either, and in 2004 when Mary McAleese got an uncontested second term. In fact, when they would be upgrading the way presidential candidates are selected in the future, maybe they could be overhaul Ireland's election process or Ireland's election system altogether, because it needs serious overhauling after 90 years. 100 years, it's almost approaching a century. All in all, recurring voter apathy at presidential elections should not be any surprise. Essentially, half the electors cannot be bothered to visit their local polling station to pick the nation's ribbon cutter in chief. Last time in 2018, turnout was 44%. In the presidential election before that, in 2011, even though there was at least one flaming row per campaign day, the turnout was just a bit better on 56%. If you go back to the tale of the two presidents, Mary, you find Mrs. McAleese was first elected in 1997 on just 48% turnout. Though the rows surrounding Mary Robertson's 1990 battle did generate a heftier 64% turnout. Now, survey data and anecdotal returns from the canvass trail strongly suggest a slump in voter participation next Friday. But folks, voting for either is supporting what's been happening in Ireland since 2020, which is not going to improve. It's only going to develop worse over time. In fairness, both candidates have campaigned hard and each has a creditable record of sincere hard work in public life. Let's also recall that both Catherine Connolly and Heather Humphreys are out there trying to win an election. It's not part of their function to entertain the masses. No, because one is cutting the shine out of the other folks. It's just all publicity stunts. But that being said, something important is missing from what should be a meaningful exercise in democracy. But folks, bear in mind, Ireland's democracy has always been controversial. What say has the population against any individual that's attempting to govern the country? They're not. They're overruled at all times. They're neglected. They're not listened to. So that would mean that Ireland's democracy is extremely controversial. The poll in Thursday's just gone by, Irish Times confirmed earlier findings and surveys for the Sunday Independent that showed Miss Connolly with a commanding lead, which is 38% over Miss Humphreys' 20%. The Fine Gael battler has rightly said she will campaign on through the final week and try to win, while her party colleagues want to see a bigger final push from their government colleagues in Fianna Fáil, given Mr. Gavin's withdrawal. But folks, don't be surprised if Heather Humphreys ends up as Ireland's future president. But it's citizens' own fault, because down through the decades, they failed to do anything about the so-called vote counting systems the day after Irish elections and votes were cast. Whoever authorised any political party to exit polling stations with boxes of citizens' uncounted votes, allegedly store them overnight and count them then the next day, when the damage was already done approaching that election. Because, folks, what happens in Ireland behind every voter's back is candidates on that ballot paper. Some of them already know that they have been elected to represent at political level for the next couple of years. But the more important survey finding this in the past week is that 55% support the idea of changing a nomination process that gives the political parties too much say in candidate choice. That decision the nomination choice anyway, folks, should come down to members of the public, which is you and I, the population. Any departure from the nomination requirement of 20 members of the Oireachtas or the support of 4 local councils would require a referendum changing something that's been in place since 1937, which is the same year that De Valera, Liam Cosgrove and the Catholic Church wrote their own constitution to suit themselves from 1937 to 2025 without being confronted or challenged by by Irish citizens. It is very hard to envisage established politicians rushing to make such a change. And experience teaches us that constitutional revisions are more often talked about than acted upon. But an even more depressed voter turnout in 6 days' time could be a very compelling argument for such change. Otherwise, it might be easier to leave the voters in peace and have our TDs and senators go the whole hog and pick the president between them. In reality, that is what is happening this time around, folks, because like all previous presidential elections, the public never had a look in, which means Ireland's electoral system in general needs to be overhauled big time. We need to forget about this believe in everything from media, TV presenters and everything else, folks, because the majority are there working hand in hand. It even comes down to protest organisers and speakers working hand in hand with what's attempting to govern the country. And I say attempting to govern the country for a reason. Okay, guys, enjoy your evening. Enjoy the weekend. Talk to you. Good luck. Bye-bye.